Hi, everyone, and welcome to @Katie Couric. Today, we're taking a look at the past 10 years. A decade ago, we partied like it was 1999, but it became clear as the new millennium began, in many ways, that party was over. From 9/11 to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to the financial crisis, here's a look at the decade that was.
The United States and our allies have prevailed.
Okay, here, we've got a rescue in progress.
People across the country are asking, how could this happen?
Stocks fell as bank stocks led the way south.
I do think it'll be a big win, yeah.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
And I just wanted to say I love him so much.
This is my last broadcast as the anchor man of the CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is.
And joining me today, Time Magazine essayist and editor-at-large Nancy Gibbs, the Washington bureau chief for The Economist, Peter David, and Kurt Loder of MTV News. And as always, we'd like to say a quick thank you to the sponsor of our web show, Dove. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Hi, Katie.
I don't know about you. When I watch these retrospectives, I always find them so moving. I don't know whether I get emotional because I feel so old or it's so kind of moving to look back on history. Do you have that same reaction?
Well, so much has passed in what seems like a short amount of time. I think your head spins.
Yeah. What would you call this decade? I mean, it really hasn't. No one has come up with a name that has really stuck. I started thinking of the decade of the despot when I was seeing Ahmadinejad and Chavez and, of course, Saddam Hussein. Then I was thinking, I don't know, the tainted decade because so many of our heroes fell from grace. What do you think, Nancy?
Well, people have called it the uh-ohs, which when you watch that and you see all the bad stuff that happened, it's easy to come away thinking that this was just a series of terrible, man-made and natural events, one after another, and it's a miracle that we made it through. I think that's, the things that we remember are naturally going to be a lot of sometimes the darkest and most catastrophic moments. But I don't think it was all quite as bad as that.
Well, your magazine called it the decade from hell.
Yes, we did. And
you don't necessarily agree with that.
I don't, actually, but partly because I think we tend to make this decade worse than it was, and the 90s especially, which we now look back on, all that peace and prosperity.
So nostalgically.
Yeah, that was nice. Can't we go back there? And I think it's easy to miss how much of what happened in this decade actually grew out of what happened in that one. It's as though history was sort of staying backstage and just in this decade came stomping out on stage and started breaking things.
And we'll talk about that in a moment, but I'm curious, Peter, what do you think? I mean, what words, in your view, describe this decade?
Well, when you asked the question, I was going to say the decade of shattered dreams, but on second thoughts, I think it depends where you were during this decade, because you're sitting here in the United States, one is aware of the idea that the American dream doesn't seem so attainable to people anymore. But for a lot of people around the world, this was a decade in which their dreams were met. I mean, if you were Indian or Chinese, there were millions and millions of people who got things in this decade that they could never have really dreamt of before. You know, even if it were just a refrigerator, a motor car, something like that. A lot of people have risen out of abject poverty in the past 10 years. And we shouldn't forget that.
So, as you say, typically we have a very myopic view of this being here in the United States, but, you know, from a worldwide perspective, in many ways, it was a very positive decade.
In many parts of the world, this was when poor people were lifted out of poverty and formed a big new middle class in countries which didn't have much of a middle class before. And those people are optimistic, and I think they expect their children to have a better life than they've had, partly because of the experiences of this decade. So it hasn't been all bad everywhere.
What about you, Kurt? How would you assess it?
Well, no offense to time, but I don't think it's like the worst decade. The worst decade is like the early parts of the 1930s or the war years in the 1940s. Those were bad times. I mean, in this decade, you know, the sequencing of the human genome was an amazing story. And just the way technology has infiltrated the culture and changed things fundamentally, I think, is really the big story.
I think when everyone looks back on this decade, I know I feel this way, and I think you all do as well. 9/11 was such a defining moment, the defining moment, I think, of the past 10 years. And I know, Nancy, you've said it's also the way the United States responded that really shaped us as a society in many ways. What do you mean by that?
I think as shocking as the event was, and I think we're totally taken by surprise that this kind of act would be and could be perpetrated against us, that people were almost as surprised by the reaction, by the very common heroism that we saw everywhere. I mean, at extraordinary levels, and generosity and compassion. And, you know, where New York, you know, particularly, but Washington as well, became such a small town. And all across the country, not just in the places that were attacked, but everywhere, the outpouring of service and of desire to help and of a need to lift up those who had been most effective, I think really surprised people, because we had been told for so long that we were such a spoiled, selfish, kind of flabby generation that had never been tested.
Do you think that really continued? To me, that was a fairly short-lived phenomenon.
I think it may have moved off as the central narrative, because, of course, the response of our government took over as the main story rather than the response of our people. But I don't think that the service stopped. And I think if you look at things like the amount of volunteering people do, the amount of charitable giving that people do, I think it actually has continued. I think people were very aware of how fortunate they were when they woke up the next morning and they realized that, you know, their family was safe, and they had taken that for granted, and they didn't anymore.
And I remember everyone saying it was the end of cynicism, but it sort of was a nanosecond for the end of cynicism.
The end of irony, I think.
Yes,
exactly.
Right? The end of irony, exactly. How do you think 9/11 shaped us culturally, Kurt?
Well, I think there's a generation of people that never expected it, but who did expect it. I mean, it was so out of the blue. And I think if you're a young person, you must just think, wow, this can happen now. It's like a new world opened up, I think.
A new vulnerability as well. And
a reminder of how vulnerable we are.
Right. And Peter, you know, obviously the war in Afghanistan, people really rallied around that. But the war in Iraq really changed everything. And we actually have a Twitter question. Someone tweeted, since I'm so into new media, as you guys know, or at least trying to be. This question was David Westball. He said, how would the world be different today had the U.S. not invaded Iraq?
Well, that's a really good question. I take my hat off to Twitter and to your questioner. Well, for a start, I think America's standing in the world would be different. I mean, we're beginning now with the new president to see the rehabilitation of America's reputation in other parts of the world. But there's no doubt that the invasion of Iraq was incredibly divisive. I remember in Europe that it's hard to think of it now, but back in 2002, 2003, people were talking about how could the world live with this great imperial hyperpower, the United States, which was all bestriding, fantastically strong, and could do anything it liked without paying any attention to any of the rules of international conduct. That was the discourse in many parts of the world back before the invasion of Iraq. Now that we're at the end of the decade, the mood is entirely different. America looks as if it's weak. Its strength was overestimated at the beginning. So maybe had there not been an invasion of Iraq, people now would still see the United States as a hyperpower, a country that had enormous reserves of resilience and strength, both military and economic and in other ways.
Some people have criticized Barack Obama, President Obama, for making too many overtures, by kind of reaching out too much and suggesting that makes the United States seem weak, to be too magnanimous to other countries throughout the world. What do you think of that assessment?
I think with him, it might be a big mistake to make that criticism now, because we don't know what's going to happen, what he will do if countries he's reached out to, who he's reached out to, refuse to take the hand he's offered. For example, he's reached out to Iran. If the Iranians don't, by the end of this year, accept the notion of good relations in return for nuclear responsibility, then we'll wait to see whether the new president is going to be tough with Iran or just give them a free pass. I suspect he will try to be tough. He'll introduce tough sanctions. He might do something more than that. We'll have to wait and see. So I think it's too early to write him off as someone who's projecting weakness and can't follow up with strength when the situation demands.
Let me ask you all a general question. It's one that someone from the BBC, the Beeb, asked me this morning, and I found myself kind of defensive, to be honest with you. He said, is America on the decline? Do people in this country feel America is on the decline? And I'm curious how you all might have answered that. Nancy?
Well, to the extent that the notion that we, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, were the sole superpower in the world, I think that there has been a humbling since then, and a recognition that there may be some downsides that go with that. But there's a difference between staying in decline as though somehow American energy and entrepreneurialism and inventiveness is never going to lift us up again. And I would disagree. The idea that there are other very powerful rising nations in the world that dilute our sole standing as a superpower, certainly. But I'm not sure people would think that was necessarily a bad thing.
What about you? Do you think America's on the decline?
I think Nancy's right that America is on the decline in the sense that there are rising powers, and certainly in the next decade and certainly in the next century, there won't be only one superpower which towers over all the other countries in the world. China and India are rising fast.
Brazil, too?
Brazil, as well, is very rich and prosperous and quite close. On the other hand, I think there's a good chance that America will continue to be a very rich and successful society once it gets over the current recession. The thing that troubles me a little bit as a new arrival in the United States is that the old idea that America could pick itself up because it was so mobile, so tolerant of change, so people were willing to move from one side of the country to the other to get a new job. I'm not sure that's so much the case anymore. There's some numbers out recently which suggest that Americans are less mobile around the United States now than they have been at any time since the Second World War.
But might that be because of economic reasons?
Well, it's because they're tied down by in homes that they have to hang on to, because they're health insurance might not be portable, or they might not be able to give up their bad jobs because they're stuck with health coverage there. So the old idea of picking up sticks and moving off to some other place where prospects were better is not so true.
Literally upward mobility, right?
Exactly.
And what about you, Kurt? I mean, when you look at this country, culturally, financially, foreign policy-wise, do you feel like, gosh, we just don't have our mojo anymore?
Well, at the moment, maybe not, but I think the most imperial aspect of the country now is the popular culture. Wherever you go in the world, people listen to American music. Kids wear hip-hop clothing. People want to see American films. That goes on and on. And even, I know when they put a McDonald's near the Louvre in Paris, people were very upset about it.
Or the Great Wall,
yeah.
or, you know.
But people want to eat McDonald's. So, you know, but this is the imperial aspect of our culture. That hasn't waned at all, I don't think.
What about financially? You know, is this the anti-Gordon Gekko decade where we all discovered painfully that greed is not good, or being overly aspirational is not good?
Well, there was certainly a lot of magical thinking that has been exposed in the
irrational exuberance.
18 months, but that was long overdue. And I actually think there's a lot of polling that suggests that there as much pain as people have suffered, and certainly if you've lost your job or your house or your health care, you've lived in a world of pain this year. But for many people, there is an obvious sense of relief that we were going down a road that was unsustainable, both as individuals and families and as a country, and a need to pull back a bit, that keeping up with the Joneses was getting to be a drag.
It went from a chicken in every pot to a flat-screen television in every living room.
I mean, if you look at even just the average American house size, that increased 100%. And cars were 89% more powerful than they had been a generation ago. We were literally bigger.
Everything
got bigger. And at some point, it just was too much. And I think people felt that. And so as we've asked people through the recession of sort of does anything feel right about this? People actually have talked about their family relationships getting stronger, which you would think families under stress would introduce a lot of tensions. But in many cases, that hasn't been the case. So I think there has been some relief that we wouldn't have chosen this, certainly, but having had it forced upon us, that we're going to make something good out of it.
Do you think it's the end of conspicuous consumption as we saw so prevalent in the earlier part of the decade? Or, you know, I always feel like these things are just temporary blips. You know, we reassess our values, and yes, we become closer, and then we just basically go back to the same bad habits. I feel like maybe I do that a little. You know, when someone dies, you think, I'm going to get to know everybody better. I'm going to have meaningful conversations with everybody I talk to because they're so amazing, and I don't really know how amazing they are until they die. And then I never do.
I think they're going to, since people are pulling back a little bit, it's time for the government to do so, don't you? I mean, I think we're leaving a generation of people with just a horrible economic situation. And when they get to be older, they're going to say, how did we get saddled with all this? Minority view, perhaps, but what do you think?
I think that's a very important point about American decline, too, is that I think you should make a real distinction between how we view our institutions and their ability to function effectively, whether it's the media or our government institutions, or certainly our financial institutions, in all of which we've lost enormous faith, versus what we still see out of individuals and the things that have been invented in this decade that are extraordinary. I mean, our gadgets that we all now live with get smaller and cheaper and more powerful every year. That never happens. Usually, you know, when they get more powerful, they get bigger and they cost more. It's been the reverse. And the level of ingenuity and inventiveness at an individual level, I think, has been extraordinary. But the institutions that we need to keep our bridges from collapsing or regulate our financial system have so far shown themselves not remotely up to the job. And that's where I think people's sense of anxiety and decline may reside.
What about, Peter, you know, there's a lot of populist anger throughout the country, and we saw evidence of that during the Tea Party protests this summer and the pushback about health care reform. What about the role of government in American society? Do you think that I don't ascribe to the feelings that, you know, we're socialistic or anything, but do you think that government is taking on too big a role when it comes to solving this nation's problems?
Well, I think Americans, and not just Americans, but people in the rich world, are schizophrenic about government. On the one hand, they expect the government to bail them out of this crisis that we're in, which really wasn't entirely of the government's making. I mean, the government was a bit player.
Well, there were some personal responsibility issues involved, too, weren't there? Not to mention global explanations that people had no control over.
Exactly. I mean, people's spending decisions, their borrowing decisions, more importantly, the behavior of investors who bought products which they didn't, financial products which they didn't understand. These people, all bear a lot of responsibility. But in an economic crisis, at a time of distress, people turn to the government for answers and also use the government as a scapegoat. And I think what we're seeing now is this schizophrenic feeling that on the one hand, the government ought to provide, the government should make us all feel secure again, deal with our vulnerabilities. And on the other, a strong reaction against the government getting too strong, taking the free enterprise economy and socializing it, and preventing us from growing rich again in the future.
But there are some people who say, hey, we paid by the rules. I took out a mortgage that I could afford to pay. I didn't overspend in terms of buying a McMansion. Why should my tax dollars go to those people who made bad decisions, who were, in fact, irresponsible?
Well, that's a natural question to ask, but it has an answer, which is that the financial system is something that we have to preserve intact, because if we don't, then if it collapsed completely, the ripple effect would affect everyone in the country terribly. So even though no one wants to reward the fat cats for the big risks they took on Wall Street, it's important to keep the banks and the institutions alive so that they can continue to lend and businesses can continue to work.
Let's talk about the changing media landscape, which I think we all have a vested interest in. Is mainstream or are traditional media sources just on their way out? Are magazines like Time Magazine or even The Economist, dare I say, are they going to be relics of a different generation pretty soon? And how do you preserve the quality? I was saying to my colleagues, just reading our pieces in Newsweek and Time, and I read The Economist too, which I love to get a different perspective that's not so nationalistic, quite frankly, but I so appreciate the writing in these magazines. Nancy's an incredible writer, and I just read a piece on in defense of our craven celebrity culture in Newsweek that I just thought was really well written. How do you preserve quality on the internet, especially when there's not really a financial model to compensate journalists yet, just sort of like what happened to musicians with iTunes? Where are we headed in terms of journalistic integrity and quality?
I think I don't think good writing is under threat, frankly. I think if you look around the web, you find loads of good writing, not just in mainstream media that have moved to the web, but in the blogosphere and in all the new products that are appearing on the web. Talent can rise and bubble up there. Bloggers can get a big following. And I think the quality of writing is very strong. What troubles me is not the quality of writing, it's the quality of checking. It's easy to do fine writing on the web, and I think that will continue. But where is there going to be a source of really authoritative reporting, investigation? Those are the expensive parts of journalism which are under threat.
I agree, and you look at a piece in a respected magazine or periodical, and you see that there are 11 anonymous sources, or there is a piece that puts torture in historical context that is clearly been vetted, and people have been interviewed or high-ranking at the Pentagon, and you think, does everyone have access to these kinds of people so they can actually write a piece that is very informed and has been properly edited and vetted?
Oh, I think even harder than that, it's very expensive to have correspondence in Kabul and in Baghdad and in bureaus
or take weeks to
around
do a
the world,
piece.
or to invest weeks or months in an investigative report that may or may not pan out. And the ability to do that at a time where once your news organization or mine has invested in it, anyone else who's aggregating content on the web can just take it and post it and essentially profit from it. This is the conversation that everyone is having, and lots of big brains are focusing on how to figure this out. But the good part of this that we sometimes forget about is all of us, I think, are so much more in conversation with our readers and viewers, and the interactivity that new media allows. I think helps keep us honest, helps keep us humble, two things that are always useful.
That's true.
And so while, yes, we have to teach ourselves and our children how to be discriminating consumers of content, that the fact that we are in touch and not sort of voices from up on high, I think is an entirely salutary development.
I agree, but does it get to a point where people feel too empowered to give their 2 cents? And I mean this in a way that it is vitriolic, vile. I'm obsessed with this, but I can't believe some of the comment sections on the internet where people, first of all, their attitudes are shocking to me. The way they express themselves is shocking, and I feel like it's really been a terrible thing in a way to make civil discourse such an oxymoron.
It's the dark side of democracy.
The dark side of democracy. That would be a good book title, wouldn't it? The dark side of democracy.
And they're all anonymous. It's really an awful thing.
But is it troubling for you all to see people maybe overly empowered, quite frankly?
Well, I'm not sure that people are empowered. I think it is very troubling when you look at this outpouring of rage and ignorance, a huge appetite for conspiracy theories, hatred, all being expressed and finding a place somewhere, out there in cyberspace. But is it really empowering? Because those people tend to drown each other out, and I'm not sure they really capture any messages that the broad spectrum of society is really buying. There's a cacophony that people are aware of, but I don't think it has a toxic effect on the way politics works or society works.
You don't?
No, I don't. I really don't. I think it's uncomfortable if you're a politician and you read all this stuff, or if you're a celebrity of any kind, and you're being denounced in hateful ways.
Even when it's not
cyberspace,
personal, I find it really sort of disillusioning. If you see a picture, for example, of Jenna Bush in her wedding dress, and you look in the comment section underneath that picture, and the level of hatred and disgust that has been sort of projected toward her. She's just in her wedding dress. I think, gosh, can you be happy for someone for just a second? It's unsettling to me. It really is.
Well, they've always been there, those people, don't you think? I mean,
they
they're
have
just
always
coming out
been
of the
there. It's
woodwork.
just that now it's in perpetuity, and it's in black and white. And these were the letters that secretaries used to throw away or write nut job on them, right? And say, wow, this person has got a screw loose. But now it's kind of out there. And what I see, and I try to avoid the comment section because I find it disturbing, but they all feed on each other. And then it becomes a kind of verbal sparring match that is just, it's strange to me.
I wonder if we'll look back and maybe this is wishful thinking, but if this ends up being a sort of transitional period where everyone had their sudden chance to say whatever they wanted.
And there will be some self-regulation, possibly.
Or just a little sanity restored to it. I mean, I think that the polarization of our political culture is a very serious and toxic factor that there's very good reason to be concerned about. But I do the old cliche about sunlight as the best antiseptic. The fact that this is coming out in the open, I think these attitudes, attitudes of hatred and bigotry have always been there, and they have always affected people's behavior and their voting patterns and done their damage in insidious ways. As we know more about it, I think it's easier to fight it.
I agree with that, and I think also if you look at these comments, and you obviously decided, you don't want to do it because you find it depressing and upsetting, and I understand that. But if you do look at them, you see pushback and you see argument and you see people mobilizing to say, well, actually, that's just rubbish. And, and some of it can be very inspiring. For example, whenever we write anything about China, virtually everyone with access to the internet in China seems to want to make a comment on our articles.
Well, that's
it's very exciting.
That is, and that obviously is unleashing a great and powerful message from people who feel oppressed and unable to do that. So that's a wonderful thing.
And it's putting people in touch. I mean, there are vigorous debates across cultures which have been made possible by the internet 4 people from very different countries who previously couldn't speak, and thanks to the fact that so many people speak English and they have access to the web, there is debate and there is self-education going on there, which is encouraging.
And finally, I could talk to you 3 for hours, but we don't have hours. But finally, what do you think the next decade will look like? If you had a crystal ball, or you were Karnak, what would you say is likely to unfold in the next 10 years? Which is an impossibly difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Well, given how many predictions we were making 10 years ago turned out to be utterly wrong, really only a fool will go here. But
well, you know what? Don't worry. We're not going to hold you to them, Nancy.
I think the thing I'm most curious about is whether our children will routinely live to be 150 years old. I think the most interesting frontier is a biotechnological one. And if you look at the speed at which medical technology and genetic technology is advancing, I think the really dramatic thing that could happen is an ability to extend life expectancy even more dramatically than it was extended with the introduction of antibiotics and things in the last century.
To pinpoint a gene and be able to alter it.
To regrow parts that wear out, whether it's neurons or spinal cord. I think the potential there is extraordinary and completely paradigm shifting.
What do you think will likely happen if you... Well, you can really do whatever you want with this question, Peter.
I think we'll see... I think we'll see continuity more than we'll see change. But one thing that interesting that will continue is that boring work, the really mindless, repetitive tasks will become something that fewer and fewer people do. It's partly connected to technology and science. But if you look back at the last 10 years or the past 20 or 30 years, one of the biggest things that has happened is that people are finding rewarding work to do, mind work, using their brains, using their imagination. And fewer people are condemned to have lives of boring drudgery as they do mechanical jobs. Quiet desperation.
Although, there was a recent survey I just read about young people saying that they would like to work at a company for life. So perhaps the need for security and to stay away from economic uncertainty might actually bring back sort of the father knows best 50s ideal of working for a company for 40 years and getting a gold watch and a pension at the end of the run.
They might want that. Whether they'll get that is not really up to them.
They'll get an iPod or something instead.
Yes. What do you think is in store for us for the next 10 years?
I think the velocity of technological change will obviously speed up, I think, and who knows what will be possible, as you say. We might live to be 150 years old. We might become one hive mind. We're so connected to each other now. There'll be more of that. So there'll be great technological change, and then there's the disturbing technological change, like human cloning. So I don't know.
Do you think do you think the celebrity culture, this sort of worshipful celebrity environment we live in now, where we can't get enough of Tiger Woods and his latest mistress, and sort of the rise and fall of these folks who are in these glass bubbles, is that going to sort of decrease or increase?
That's always been with us. Ever since there have been celebrities, there's always been an inordinate amount of interest.
But doesn't it seem stronger today than it ever has been?
It's just everywhere.
Because of all the different outlets?
Yeah, you get tired of it. Well, I have. I don't know.
In Newsweek this week, they talk about this celebrity worship being sort of one of the last unifying experiences we have. Because as a country, we don't all gather around the water cooler and talk about the final episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show necessarily, or maybe you do that with the Oscars once a year. And so it was kind of an interesting take that it's a way to make us feel a little more of a community. I'd rather not do it by discussing John and Kate plus 8, but that's just me.
Who wants to live in that community?
Yeah. But I think a lot of people like throwing rocks at that community, or the community of celebrity. Anyway, well, Kurt Loder and Peter David and Nancy Gibbs, thank you guys so much for assessing a decade in half an hour or so. Really appreciate it. And Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year.
Also. Yeah.
Happy 2010. And also, thanks to all of you for watching. Have a safe and happy New Year as well. I'm Katie Couric. Now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.